All right, welcome to the deep dive on Daniel's Abomination that causes desolation. If you haven't watched the core 70th 7 videos, I recommend doing that first. We're going to have a series of deep dive videos. This is one of those, but they build very heavily or rely very heavily on the framework, the understanding of the 70th 7. So definitely watch those because we'll be referencing the 70th 7 in these deep dive videos. But we got a lot to cover, so let's dive in. So to refresh our memory, we're talking about Daniel chapter 12. Again, recap. There is this prophecy inside the 77s. It is also mentioned several other places in Daniel, so it's not just in the 70th 7. And so we'll also address some of those aspects when we cover some other chapters in other deep dive videos. But today we just want to focus on specifically the abomination that causes desolation. Obviously, this phrase is very well known, and there's a lot of debate about it. And so there's a number of passages in Scripture we'll end up jumping around in order to kind of tie a nice bow on the whole thing and make sense of coordinating all of those passages. So here we are in Daniel chapter 12. From the time that the daily sacrifice is abolished and the abomination that causes desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. Now, this is not the first occurrence in Daniel. You're going to see we're going to go a little bit in reverse order. One time point governs both of these events, and this grammar demands simultaneity. There will be some who will say it doesn't, and that you could read it in a different way, and that is true. Grammatically speaking, you can do that, but this is the normal way to read this grammar. The most of the time, that the grammar, I'm not going to unpack the exact Hebrew words, but my understanding from reading scholars is the general consensus is the most natural reading for this passage is that they're the one in the same event. If looking for other places where the kind of conjunctive word there, that word "and," can be used to connect things that are not happening at the same time, there are some cases, but that's more the exception rather than the rule. So the rule is to read it the way it reads naturally in English, which is from the time that A and B happen, there will be this measuring. Okay, so that links for us the abolition of the daily sacrifice with the setting up of abomination. They happen at the same time. Doesn't imply that they're the same thing, but that they happen at the same time, because we're saying from the time these two things happen, we're going to measure. And so it implies that they happen at the same time. So same event, at least temporarily, from two different angles. Now we go back to Daniel chapter 9, and we read there where it mentions that in the middle of the 7, that is the 70th 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering, and on a wing he will set up an abomination that causes desolation, until the end that is decreed is poured out. Again, the two here are linked. So there's multiple places where this linkage seems to happen or be present between the ending of the sacrifice and offering and the setting up of the abomination that causes desolation. Happens in the middle of the 7. Until implies a later unfolding end. So until the end that is decreed is poured out. And in the 70th 7 videos, the 3 core videos, we unpack this a little bit. We're going to retrace some of those steps because they're important. This verse is a challenging verse according to scholars. I'm no Hebrew scholar, so I'm just going to be telling you what scholars say. Obviously, they have different interpretations of kind of what this means, but the Hebrew is the Hebrew, and so some of that is established, and they're just debating what does it mean, or what does it apply to? How should we interpret this? Does it apply to Christ? Is it an antichrist, etc.? But some of the core words are known, or all of the core words, I should say, are known. But this on a wing we mentioned in the other videos is interesting. So here I've translated it, or I've put on the screen on a wing. In the other videos, I actually had the straight translation that the NIV and a number of translations have, which is on a wing of the temple. They insert the word temple in there in various ways, or at the temple he will set up an abomination. But the word temple is not there. We're going to unpack that a little bit later in this video. But for now, let's just point out it says on a wing. That's the literal translation, is on a wing. It doesn't say the word temple anywhere in that phrase. Furthermore, as we mentioned before, I want to read these notes again. These are going to be in a lot of your Bibles. If you just look this verse up, you'll see in the footnotes. If you have a study Bible, this will be there. So again, this is not me making this up. This is me bringing to you some things that you may have not noticed or heard of, but that are relevant for us interpreting this passage correctly and deciding what actually is the abomination that causes desolation. So the Hebrew, again, literally on a wing. The meaning is debated. Some render it on the wing of abominations or on the pinnacle of the temple. But again, the word temple is not there. The Septuagint reads upon the temple. That's really where the temple word got introduced, it seems, from what I understand. The phrase is difficult, so it's acknowledged by the translators that this is not a straightforward verse to translate. There are some unique phrases here. The phrase is difficult. Most English translations insert temple, but the Hebrew word for temple is not here. I think that's actually, that latter part is my additional note. But again, you can go look this up. So that's one point. Next point is, what is the actual phrase? It is this shekutz meshamim. That might be butchered. If so, I'm sorry. Someone who knows how to pronounce Hebrew can correct me. This phrase appears in Daniel 11, chapter 11 and chapter 12, and I'll say that it's also referred to other places, just not used that explicitly. So the three explicit usages are chapter 9, chapter 11, chapter 12. And it's used throughout the Old Testament, specifically for acts of covenant unfaithfulness. This is a slightly different note again, but the idea is that, as we have mentioned before, and one of the main points that we'll make throughout this video, is that the issue at hand is covenantal. And if we're thinking about external factors or more earthly factors like Roman flags and things like that, we've missed the point. It's not that those aren't relevant. They obviously did come. The Romans are the ones who burned Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, destroyed the whole city, and killed lots of people in leading up to and including 70 AD. But that's the consequence of covenantal unfaithfulness. That isn't itself the thing that is most disturbing. And the most disturbing is the covenant disobedience. So we see that this in the language here, again, and if we look at where else it occurs in the Old Testament, the general connotation is going to be one of covenantal unfaithfulness. All right, so this one, people talk about the antecedent of him is ambiguous in the Hebrew. So what is it referring to, that word there? It could refer to A, the desolator, the B, the desolated one. Again, city, temple, but temple's not there. That's implied, or people are inserting that. I would argue it's not even implied. Or C, the one who confirms the covenant that was mentioned previously. So we're kind of talking about a he in these verses. If you, again, watch the other videos, if you haven't, we talk about the great he debate from this passage, and there's three different he's, but we make the case that they're all the same he. There actually aren't three different he's. That's the same person, and it's Jesus talked about the whole time. So any he here, we would refer back to him. The NIV offers the alternative on it, and it says the desolated city. So there's some uncertainty again here, even in this phrase, on what is this. So the end is decreed. It's getting poured out, but whom or what is it getting poured out upon? And that's a little bit fuzzy. What you're going to see here is that we're happy with either translation or either interpretation, because in a sense, there is a decree of judgment getting poured out on Jesus. He's taking upon himself the sins of the world. At the same time, that event, as we will describe here, results in very directly in a covenantal consequence of desolation that is decreed. Daniel, this prophecy is decreeing that very specific judgment. And so that also is happening. Well, who's that getting poured out on? That is getting poured out on the city and the temple, even though the city and temple are not mentioned here. But if it's getting poured out on the desolator, the one that causes the desolation, yes, it gets poured out on them. That would be Old Covenant Israel. So either way that goes, I don't feel like that really a lot hinges on that for our interpretation here in terms of, the main point that we're getting to here is not altered by that interpretation going either way on that particular phrase. So again, drilling into the phrase itself, the abomination that causes desolation. All right, we want to introduce a concept here that I feel like is important, but seems to be overlooked a lot in the reading that I've done and in listening to other folks talk about this. So the phrase has a built-in causal arrow. It is A to B, right? There's the abomination that causes or leads to desolation. The abomination produces the desolation. There are two things talked about here. One is the cause and one is the effect. And so if A and B are the same event, this phrase, I think, becomes kind of incoherent. It's like, what does that mean if they happen at the same time? How is the one causing the other? That would be a very, I guess you could have that, but it's a very quick, compressed time for the cause and effect to happen, at the same time, essentially. So in our case here, Roman flags in the temple don't cause the temple's destruction. That is the thing to think about and kind of chew on this for a second. So by the time Roman flags are in the temple, they're not causing the abomination that all of a sudden, that's an abomination now. That's terrible. The Roman flags are there. God is now going to bring judgment or destruction upon the temple. No, that judgment has already been decreed, and the Roman flag is the destruction. By the time the Roman flags show up, all is lost, right? The temple is truly desolate. It's been abandoned by God. Otherwise, they wouldn't have gotten there in the first place, the Romans and their flags. So the idea is that, again, there's an implied temporal separation between cause and effect, but doesn't separate cause from effect from a causation standpoint. All right. Similarly, an idol in the temple. There's multiple cases where that happened historically, and so that's a desolation, that's a desecration, but it isn't the idol in the temple that's causing that desolation. In all of those historical examples in the Old Testament, it is covenant unfaithfulness, it is disobedience and rebellion of the covenant people that leads to that event. Okay, the cause must precede the effect. Old Testament pattern, just alluded to, covenant violation is what happens first. And then eventually, when there's no repentance and there's multiple opportunities, and God is merciful and patient, but eventually divine judgment arrives and is decreed. And then the end is set at that point, but it doesn't happen at that point. There's an unfolding of time. The multiple exiles and oppressions that happened against the Jewish people, the Israelites in Old Covenant Israel, were prophesied for long periods of time before they actually happened. The judgment had been set, and God said it's going to happen, and don't think that it's not going to happen, and then eventually it happens. So that pattern is there. We can see it in Deuteronomy, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, multiple Old Testament examples, so this is not a new concept scripturally. The ultimate covenant violation, is the claim we're making here, is killing the covenant maker. You can think of no greater violation of the covenant, no greater insult to God, and no greater rebellion than actually killing the covenant maker. And again, we see this when you kind of start to see this, it's hard to, you kind of can't unsee it. Jesus has a lot to say about the coming judgment on Jerusalem for their rejection of all the prophets, and then eventually him. The parable that is worth going and reading is about the ruler or wealthy owner or whatever that puts his estate in charge of some people in charge of his estate, and then he leaves for a long time, and then he sends servants to go check on them. And they beat them up, and then eventually he sends the son, and they kill the son as well. They kill the other guys. Eventually they kill the son. And go look up what he says is going to happen to those guys. Actually, Jesus asked them, what do you think is going to happen? They said, he's going to send his guys. He's going to take those guys out. And he said, yeah, that's right. The owner will send his armies. Tuck that away for some later videos. He will send his armies and destroy those wicked men. And Jesus said, yeah, that's right. That sounds about right. So there is this idea of killing the Son. Killing the Messiah was the ultimate. It was putting an end to sin. If we go back to Daniel chapter 9, those 6 key things that are being accomplished during the 77s, one of them is putting an end to sin. One is finishing sin, finishing transgression. Well, that I can think of no greater, nor can you probably, cherry on top, or whatever, little bow on top, or straw that breaks the camel's back, although it's not really a straw. I would say that's a tree trunk. Killing the Messiah. That was it. That was the end of the line, right? That was your last chance. He sent the Son, and you not only didn't just ignore him, you actually killed him and had him brutally murdered. And so that is the ultimate covenant violation. That will bring about desolation of an order and the likes of which we should be terrified by. And all of a sudden, you look at the language of the Olivet Discourse, you look at Revelation, that is what you see. Absolutely horrendous, so bad, so terrible, so provocative and shocking in its description that we think it must be the end of the physical universe, right? And there certainly is apocalyptic language or prophetic language, which again cover in the Revelation videos. But the point is, it's so bad, that is what is the language that God is using to describe those things. And we almost sort of forget that's what he's talking about, like in the Olivet Discourse. And we think, oh, it must be the end times, the end of the universe. And look, the stars are falling and the moon turns to blood and all these terrible things and death and destruction. But those things are associated with this, the killing of the Messiah and the unfolding judgment that happens not at that moment in time, but happens later, but is causally linked to the crucifixion. Okay, so that is the ultimate covenant violation. There can be nothing worse than that, no greater sin than that. Matthew 23, you'll hear a few times in this video, Jesus said to them, "Your house is left to you desolate." That's after he goes at great length to describe their rejection of the prophets in the past and their rejection of him. He says, I'm going to send you people to you, is basically the disciples, the apostles that were going to go out in the early church, and they'll testify, but you're going to kill them. So he already tells them, this is what I know is happening. And so your house is left to you desolate as a result of those things. The desolation came after the rejection. And he talks about after describing the rejection, then he says you're going to be desolate. But that's before the destruction. Okay, so the destruction hasn't arrived, but he says it's going to arrive. So the cross is in 33 AD. The desolation arrives, unfolds. So I always want to try to clarify when we say 70 AD, it's not like there's that specific day the temple burned. There's destruction and all hell is breaking loose. Literally, see the Revelation videos. All hell is breaking loose and fire's getting rained down for several years at least, but we'll argue from the 70 to 7 that really that entire period, the second half 70 to 7, is a period of judgment. And so that is not like it all has to be concentrated in 70 AD. It's not a single day. Does not have to be the Jewish war, 3.5 years, but we'll cover that elsewhere in depth as well. But that 3.5 isn't years, it's the second half of the 70th, which is 35 years. So this whole period from the cross to the final desolation, and again, there's no hard stop in 70 AD. There's still some bad things happening later, the few years following that. I think there were still some additional uprisings at some point, and those got crushed as well. So, keep that in mind. It's not a hard stop or some line in the sand that has to be drawn. The idea is that over a period of years, absolute and utter desolation took place and has never been recovered from. There is no temple, etc. So cause, then effect. That's what we're looking at with this phrase. Now, another key phrase, jumping over to Matthew 24, which talks about the same things and is where Jesus references Daniel. So this verse here. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel. So it makes it crystal clear. We know he's quoting Daniel. He says it. This in the holy place is not the term for Holy of Holies. There is a term for Holy of Holies, and this isn't that term. Okay? This is not that term. So this is, again, kind of this issue of the temple and where is it? Is it even in the scripture? And what I'm going to show you is it's not really even there. And so this is not the Holy of Holies. It's a more general term. The term is a holy place, and so it's translated that way correctly. But it's general, not specific. Here's some examples so you can kind of have a frame of reference for what that phrase does mean. It's used of the temple precinct. It's used of the ground where Moses stood, so holy ground. It's used of Jerusalem as the holy city, so the holy place, referring to the city. It's also used of the entire Holy Land itself, so it could be all of the land of Israel. All of that is called the Holy Land. So multiple general uses of this term, and it is very much not the Holy of Holies. That is a very specific term that these writers, obviously God and the Holy Spirit as the inspirer, and as well as Matthew and the other writers of the New Testament are well aware of that term, and they know how to use it when they're supposed to be using it. But this term was not used. As, of course, this is a quote from Jesus. He also knew the term, and he didn't use that term. So it doesn't mean the inner court. It's not the Holy of Holies. It's not the holy place. It's a general word. It's not, the word temple is not here. Okay, when you see the abomination that causes desolation, this is Mark's version. You're going to see in a minute a table that shows that Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have the same passage, but slightly different in a very, very important way. So Mark chapter 13, when you see it standing where it does not belong. So that's another key phrase related to the abomination, is that we see now something that is not in Daniel. So a little bit of an extra piece here, standing where it does not belong. This is a masculine participle for standing, implying that the abomination, which that word is a neuter word, so it's neither masculine nor feminine, but the standing is masculine, and that's odd. In fact, I think if I remember right, even Matthew does not have it that way, but Mark has it that way specifically. So you could say that, it's a mistake if you're in the critical whatever literary criticism camp. I'm in it's inspired, and so every word is inspired and correct. And so I think this is a helpful thing that Mark has provided here by giving the masculine participle, which is that it's a he. Even the Antichrist crowd agrees with that and says, yeah, it's a someone, not a something. So that's why certain camps looking for the Antichrist, either Antiochus Epiphanes in the years leading up to Christ, so in the 100 BC range, or the Romans in the 70 AD time frame, or in the future tribulation for the futurist camp. So all of the camps that involve a focus on the Antichrist will acknowledge that this masculine aspect is there that implies that it's a person, not just a thing. Okay, where it does not belong. Boy, that's a fascinating one. This one is good. So where it does not belong. An abomination is there a place an abomination does belong? That's not really what is implied here. I think what it's talking about is it's very, very out of place. So the traditional understanding is things like Roman flags, they don't belong in the temple. That was, an affront to God. They weren't supposed to be there. Okay, that's true. A pagan idol in the temple, that happened multiple times over the history of the nation of Israel and the Old Covenant. The Zealots, by the end of 70 AD, the Zealots had taken over the temple. They were using it as a fortress to fight against the Romans. That certainly is not the point of, the purpose of the temple was not to be a fortress. And so, a future Antichrist in a temple would certainly be out of place. But I'm going to throw in this little side note here for you. In a temple that God wouldn't even care about. So I'm not sure how bothersome that should be. If there was a third temple rebuilt, is God there? Is the Shekinah glory coming back to that place? If there's sacrifice reinstated, lambs are being sacrificed, does it matter? Does it matter? I don't think so. It's hard to read the New Testament and think that God's going to care about animal sacrifices again. But I digress. So let's stay on track. Certainly an Antichrist figure who doesn't love God and is anti-God and all things good and holy, being in the temple represents something very out of place. But the Messiah on a cross just outside Jerusalem is very debatably, and we're going to argue, is the most out of place. If you want to talk about something that is where it does not belong, how about the Messiah who long prophesied, long looked for and hoped for and talked about and prophesied about, arrives and comes to his own people, and his own people not only ignore him, but go above and beyond and put him on a cross. And that happens not in some random backwatersville, but right outside Jerusalem, in Jerusalem. But you could, whether it's in Jerusalem or right outside, it's still the Holy Land. Remember that location of the holy place. Abomination standing in the holy place. Still fits either way. So I think the crucifixion is generally thought to have been just outside the old Jerusalem, but within, greater Jerusalem, and certainly within the promised land, within the nation of Israel. So that's very out of place. That is very, very, very out of place. It does not belong there. He does not belong there. That cross does not belong there. It's very, very wrong. So we think about like something isn't right about a situation. This one qualifies as something is very, very wrong. So the murder of the sacred one on sacred ground is what is being implied by these verses. So some more details. The words temple and sanctuary, are they even there? So in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, the word temple, no. Word sanctuary, no. It literally says on a wing. There's no word about building or temple in that verse. In the Daniel 11 place that abomination that causes desolation appears, the word temple is not there. The word sanctuary is there, but it's in a separate clause. It's a list of several things, and it lists the sanctuary. Of course, that's not shocking or proof of the abomination needing to be there. Why? Because if you recall from Daniel chapter 9, we know that the people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. So we know the word sanctuary, and we know that there's going to be destruction there. But again, that does not require that the abomination be placed there or be standing there. It requires that the sanctuary be destroyed. And so as long as an interpretation of all of these passages includes that, it's textually valid. Daniel chapter 12, also no temple, no sanctuary. The Tamid, which is the daily sacrifice, and then Sheketz Meshumim, which is the abomination, those are mentioned there. Nothing about a temple. Daniel does use those words in other places, so it's not as if he doesn't know the word. He certainly does know both of those words and uses them, but not here, not when he's describing the abomination that causes desolation. How about the New Testament? Matthew chapter 24, no and no. It is again the general phrase for a holy place and not the words for temple and sanctuary. The chapter in Mark, there's no location word at all. So again, no and no. And finally, the Luke chapter also has the abomination phrase, but does not have either the temple or the sanctuary mentioned. Again, Matthew uses those words 14 plus times in other passages, so it's not as if these guys don't know these words. They did know those words, and so their absence is conspicuous in the phrases or the verses where the abomination is mentioned and described. It's noteworthy. So the temple and sanctuary are not there. So it's not a requirement that the abomination happen in the temple. So again, we're saying the abomination is the crucifixion of Jesus, and the answer or the critique might be, well, that's not in the temple. It doesn't have to be in the temple. So agreed, it's not in the temple. The Bible doesn't say that the abomination that causes desolation has to be in the temple. That is a wrong interpretation. And we're making the point here, and with this documents and collection of videos, that there's a lot of support on a number of different levels, to include the 70th seven and the math that works out. So remember the math. The math shows that, and that math works when the crucifixion is the center of the 70th seven. So that is itself a very powerful line of evidence that the crucifixion, which the abomination, is referenced all alongside, as the midpoint of the 70th seven. And so the crucifixion date makes all the math work. And so that is itself compelling. Okay. One of the challenges to this view would be that, Matthew 24 in the Olivet Discourse, it says, when you see the abomination of desolation, flee. Okay, you can go look that up, read that passage, refresh your memory on it. So when you see, you should flee. So wouldn't this mean flee at the cross? If the cross is the abomination that causes desolation, wouldn't Jesus have been saying, when you see that, you should flee? And he certainly wasn't telling them to flee at the cross, although they did flee in the Garden of Gethsemane the night before. But certainly they were told to stay in Jerusalem. So I fully agree. The command to flee at the cross would not make any sense and would be very difficult to deal with. So let's deal with it, though, because I think there is an answer to it. But we have to do a little bit of a deep dive, and that's fair because Matthew and Mark both contain this phrase, let the reader understand. You go look it up in your verse. It's kind of a parenthetical thing. If you have a red letter Bible, it usually has it not in red, I believe. So Jesus is talking, then there's this little parenthetical insert type of thing. Let the reader understand. So that's interesting. That's not anywhere else in the New Testament. So that is a very unique phrase here to this passage that is an interpretive clue, or at least as we read it, it's a verbal, or whatever, lexical clue that we need to perk up and pay attention. Let the reader understand. He's like, hey, don't miss it. There might be something to miss here, or maybe it's complicated or whatever. You could think of this as either Jesus saying, whoever reads Daniel should understand this. I'm talking about the abomination of desolation. Pay attention. The author himself saying, reader, think carefully here. Like, whoever's reading this, you got to pay attention. There's some nuance here. There's something here that you need to be aware of. Again, that's a clue. That's an important marker. You don't read that in anywhere else, again, in the New Testament. So you're just reading passages, Jesus is saying things, the disciples, the book of Acts, etc. Never has this in there. So that's noteworthy. So not anywhere else. It requires interpretation is what that implies, or one way we could think about that. It means, pay attention. You got to think about this. It's not exactly straightforward. Then we jump over to Luke. And this is fascinating. Luke, the same passage is in play here, and he says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. So abomination that causes desolation gets totally swapped for surrounded by armies. Luke describes what the arriving desolation will look like. It will look like Jerusalem surrounded by armies, and when you see that, you should flee. Its desolation is near. It is about to happen. Luke interprets the coded language of Daniel and the let the reader understand stuff into plain speech. One of the other interesting things is that Matthew and Mark primarily wrote, I believe, to Jewish audiences. Luke is considered the more Greek and sort of secular is not the right word, but to a Greek audience, to a non-Jewish audience, a Gentile audience. And so the language he uses is different in various ways. And so what's interesting is this passage, he's quoting the same passage that the other Synoptic Gospels did, but he's sort of going, let the reader understand. It's complicated. You can easily miss it, and if you're not a Jewish audience that is familiar with Daniel, then you'll have no idea what that's talking about. So let me just tell you. And so he instead just replaces it, what is implied, what he's stating, or what we're inferring that he's stating by this verse. He's inferring that the other guys, when they quote the abomination that causes desolation, that what they really mean is the Jerusalem being surrounded by armies. What we're going to show is that is the desolation. That's the linkage again, that, it's the abomination that causes desolation, but there's the cause and there's the effect. So just real quick, again, lining these up just so you know that they are in fact the same passage. They're almost identical in language. Matthew and Mark have this, let the reader understand. Luke does not, but the rest of the language is basically the same. Let those flee. So you're supposed to flee when you see the abomination that causes desolation. Let the reader understand. In Luke, you're told to flee when you see the armies around Jerusalem. So that's not fleeing at the cross. That is fleeing when you see the desolation aspect of the abomination. So again, just showing here that those passages are indeed basically identical, except for that swap that Luke does. And then he doesn't feel the need to say, let the reader understand, because he gave you the understanding you're supposed to have and made it very plain. So putting it all together, what do we have? A number of things. Recall the epexegetical genitive form of that phrase, which means we would translate it in English, the abomination, namely its desolation. So it's sort of like flip sides of the same coin. It's like a complex, an event complex, meaning the abomination and its desolation are tightly correlated, but in a certain way. And what we're saying is that way is temporally they're not directly linked. In fact, it's sort of odd and weird to have it be linked. But causally, they are linked. Okay? So one reality, covenantally inseparable, but temporally separable. That's what the abomination that causes desolation is. And what you're going to see is that resolves a lot of the complexity around it, the difficulty of interpreting it. What does it mean? And how can these passages mean? Because sometimes if we're talking about the abomination part, we're talking about the crucifixion. if we're talking about the desolation side, we're talking about temporally a different event, but they go together. Why? Because in God's eyes, when you crucified the Messiah, you brought desolation. It's coming. It's only a matter of time, and be ready. And that's where a lot of the Olivet Discourse makes sense, which we also cover in the document and in different deep dive videos, where it ties all of these things together. The 70th seven helps us understand all these things and link them together. And it is this separation between the abomination and its desolation, the desolation that came because of it, but they're linked together in terms of covenantal consequence. I'm an engineer, kind of an engineer nerd. For those who've heard of theories of relativity and that stuff, it's a little bit like entanglement. That's kind of what I think, which is that two particles can be very far away but can be linked. And so maybe someone can go unpack that. I'm only joking, but that's the only thing I have been able to think of that's sort of a related analogy, which isn't going to be helpful for most regular people, but for the nerds it might be fun and entertaining, to say that there are sort of two parts of a whole that aren't a coin. We think of a coin, that's probably the other analogy, but a coin, you have both right there, right? You can see both sides. This is the one half of the coin lives here and the other half lives here, and you kind of have to do like this to see the both sides. So coin analogy breaks down because of the temporal separation between the two events, but they are very much linked in God's mind, and in the biblical sort of biblical mind, you could say they are very tightly linked. So why convey it this way? Okay, you might say, hey, at this point, this is very confusing. I mean, isn't there a simpler way to do this? Well, okay, you could always say that, right? Like Daniel could have just written down the year. Jesus is going to come in this year according to this culture's calendar, because people have different calendars, right? Could have just done that, but that's not what happens. But why do I think it's conveyed this way? I actually think there's a reason. And it's so we never split the two apart in our minds, okay? Because of the 35-year unfolding between them. It might be very natural to think, oh, okay, well, Jesus came, now he's gone. Those who don't believe, get over it, right? We're moved on. And then later, this destruction happens. Well, it's the Romans. It has nothing to do with God. It has nothing to do with Jesus. He's been dead for 35 years. It's blah, blah, blah. So I think part of it is related to that, to say, okay, these two events, they go together. That destruction that came from Rome's hand was brought by God and was because of this event. The rejection of the Messiah is what was the final straw that broke the camel's back and brought the final and complete end. Of course, what's cool about it, lest we get too depressed with that reality, we have to remember that. But the door is open in Christ and always will be, even for Jews, the ones that crucified him even, right? Jesus said that on the cross, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So forgiveness is available. Paul explains this concept in Romans 9 through 11, kind of this fascinating thing that their rejection brought the open door for the Gentiles, but also it's the door open for the Jews as well. And so there's neither Jew nor Gentile in Christ. Both are invited in. And so this isn't some kind of permanent ethnic exclusion. Quite the opposite. It's an expansion from a limited ethnic inclusion to global ethnic inclusion. So everybody is involved or included and invited. But we need to keep those two things connected, and that's what's happening with this phrase. All right. 70th seven is key because the math is really helpful. So the conversation context for the New Testament passages and the Old Testament is, when will all these things be fulfilled? Okay, they're asking, angels are asking angels, disciples are asking Jesus. And so that's the context. Well, what's the answer? It's when the 77s are fulfilled. When the 70th seven is finished, then all of the 77s are complete. That's what the original prophecy in Daniel 9 says. All of these things will be accomplished during this period. And then in chapter 12, the questions between the angels, more specific. When will all these astonishing things be fulfilled? They'll be fulfilled. And then in Daniel chapter 12, it gives that time frame, those numbers, those markers. This is when they'll be fulfilled. This is when the end will come. And so the 70th math becomes important here, again, because all of these things have to be complete during that period. So that eliminates immediately a few things. It eliminates Antiochus Epiphanes from being the abomination that causes desolation. Why? Because he happened before the 70th seven. That's why. So that one's not valid. How about distant future? Nope, also invalid. Why? Because it's after the end of the 70th seven. There's no longer a place for future the 77 being a future 7-year period, and things taking place during that period. No, that 70th 7 is, we know the math now, we know the dates, and so that brings a constraint here to the abomination. So we know when that period is. What does it mean? It means the work of the cross is not complete until the 70th completes. Okay, so there is this overlap period that is of great interest, and you'll see in the Revelation document and the Revelation videos that the second half of the 70th 7 is a very unique period in history, and that's why it gets a lot of attention in the New Testament. Okay, how many verses can you think of where the New Testament author says there's neither Jew nor Greek, neither Jew nor Gentile anymore, right? Why? Because at that time it was very confusing, because there were actually both. There was still an old temple, and sacrifices happening every day, and the original Christians were Jews. And so you have this sort of interesting overlap and potential for confusion. And you have a period of unfolding where the work of the cross isn't totally complete. Now, this is why, again, an area where I think we get tripped up, because we, as evangelicals, as believers in Jesus and Bible believers, we say, oh, the work of the cross is done. Like, it's the finished work, right? We preach lots of sermons and have lots of teachings about the finished work of Christ. And that's all true and good. I agree with all of that. All of that is completely valid, and we should do that. However, there is also, it's that and this, which is the cross also had some unfolding work that was happening, meaning the old covenant was essentially null and void at the cross. But practically speaking, the playing out of that reality took 35 years, roughly, again. And prophetically, it's that very specific period, plus those 2 extra markers, like, boom, that's the period. So it's showing that it's going to take some time to unwind that thing, but it is on its way out. The book of Hebrews says what is, fading and whatever is fading away will soon be obsolete, right? So it's like the words are, it's now in the process of fading. Eventually, it's going to be totally gone. That's the language of the New Testament outside of Revelation, but also in Revelation. That's what the visions are about. So the 70th, when it completes, that's when the work of the cross, which includes the judgment period. That's why, because the cross inaugurates the new, but it passes judgment on the old, because the old is what brought the crucifixion. Again, the abomination, that causes desolation. So you can't think about the 70th without kind of that dual reality of, yes, the cross and the judgment, right? Yes, Jesus and the new, but also the phasing out of the old. And the phasing out of the old didn't just go quietly. That's the thing, right? It went because God was bringing covenant destruction that was promised and decreed and needed to happen. He was going to do that. And so he did. And so it was a very loud crash. The analogy you can think of is go read Revelation chapter 18, and it happens like a angel throwing a big rock into the sea is the great crashing. Okay, so summarizing this reading, what is it all when we put it all together? It's that the abomination is the crucifixion. The desolation part is the covenantal consequence of judgment unfolding on Old Covenant Israel. The abomination, the crucifixion, was a moment in time. The desolation unfolded over 35 years. And so that's part of the confusion, is baked into that reality, that the flip sides of this coin are not exactly the same thing. They're not the same face on a coin. They're structurally very different. One's a unique moment in time. The other is an unfolding and a whole bunch of actions and things that take place in history that are a part of that desolation. So they're not temporally the same, and even one of them is short, and then the other is very long. So this abomination was standing in a holy place. That means on a cross in the holy city, where he ought not be. Boy, you can do a whole, just pull this up in your next devotional time and just kind of chew and meditate on that and just think about how profound that is and the heaviness of that. Where he ought not be. That's the understatement of all of history. When you see potential challenge to this understanding, but Luke squares it for us. The desolation arriving, the armies. We'll cover also, it's covered in the Revelation document and the videos, that there is this historical reality of the Jews, the believing Jews in Jerusalem, at least, but probably more than just Jerusalem, escaping this coming judgment, and that's the admonition to flee. That's when you see the armies coming, you need to go. Notice also in that passage, Jesus says that when you hear that he's there, the Messiah's here, he's there, he's over there, don't go out looking for it's not me. That's what he's saying. It's not me. Why? Because there would be a very real temptation for these believers in this very unique time to think, oh, maybe because they thought he's coming back soon, right? That was the very real expectation. You can read that in the other letters. Notice they never say he is. They don't predict. There's no date. So I'm not thinking that the scriptures are wrong, but you get the flavor from the writings of the inspired scriptures, which came through humans, inspired word of God, but with some human flavor in there, that there was an expectation that he might be right around the corner soon. And he was in the form of judgment. We'll unpack that elsewhere. But you would think that it would be very tempting to think, oh, he's going to come back, right? Rome's going to surround us. And then just like the days of old in the Old Testament, Jesus is going to come back and he's going to squash them. And they still didn't have the full understanding of the kingdom that he was setting up, right? They thought it was going to be a Davidic kingdom, and it was, but not in the way of ruling in Jerusalem, Jesus sitting on a throne, an earthly throne. That's not how it was going to happen, but there would be a very real temptation to think that. And to stay in Jerusalem thinking, oh, we're not going anywhere, he's going to come back. He's saying, no. When it's time, when this happens, when this desolation is coming, when you see the surrounding army surrounding Jerusalem, run. I'm not coming to save it. You need to run, or you will get swept up in that desolation, okay? Luke helps us understand this bit of a conundrum by clarifying what does let the reader understand. Apparently, it means Matthew and Mark's abomination that causes desolation gets swapped with when you see armies surrounding Jerusalem. Again, in the context of that passage and what Jesus is saying, it makes sense, because what would they see with their eye? What would be the cue to run? That's why Luke clarified, it's not the abomination so much as it's desolation, but it's appropriate scripturally to talk about them as if they're the same thing, because they are, but they are separated in time. Final conclusion, the prophecy is about him. We're going to keep making this point. Daniel is not about an antichrist. Yes, there's a history of empires and all that stuff, so he's not the only actor on the stage, okay? But he's the one that matters on the stage. The whole play is to get him to come front and center and for us to be able to see that. And so all of it is about him. Again, from a purpose standpoint, I'm aware that there are other players talked about in the book of Daniel. But from beginning to end, the whole point of the 77s, the whole point of all the other visions in Daniel is to talk about Jesus, his coming, and the kingdom that he was going to come, that rock from heaven that crushes the other kingdoms and then grows to fill the whole earth and is an everlasting kingdom. That is what it's about. And the crucifixion as the abomination that causes desolation, along with the other aspects of the 70th seven, makes all of that make sense. And it ties things together. It makes sense of the Olivet Discourse and as presented in the three synoptic gospels. And as I've keep mentioning in the videos, it also makes sense of Revelation. Ties that stuff together as well, which again, somewhat related to the, definitely related to the abomination that causes desolation, because it's about the cross and the ensuing judgment, and some other things. And so the abomination and its desolation is definitely covered in Revelation. So this understanding of Jesus on the cross being the abomination that causes desolation makes a lot of things click into place.